In this video, I'm going to be taking you through this 8x10" oil painting of a bull moose. I'm going to talk about my process on how I paint wildlife, how I compose the piece, and the steps along the way. So whenever I'm painting a wildlife subject such as this, I like to cover the area around my subject prior to starting the actual animal. So in this case, because it's a smaller painting, I'll cover the entire panel before actually getting into the moose. I was fortunate enough to have this bull moose right outside our camper one morning in a recent trip into the forest. It was a very cool and foggy morning, and the blue sky radiated through the fog, creating a sort of a bluish hue to the scene overall. And that kind of inspired me to get started with what you're seeing right now. And so I used titanium white, a little bit of ultramarine blue, and as well as some phthalo blue to create these bluish tones throughout the background and foreground. And I used burnt sienna when I wanted to darken the tone or maybe perhaps warm up some of the areas in the foreground, which is what you're seeing right now. Sketching out my subject in a thin wash of burnt sienna or color of your choice is something that I prefer to do before getting into any of this area around my subject. And then when I'm painting the background and foreground, I try to be very careful to go around the outline that I've established of the moose itself. At this point in time, it's also important to me to keep the paint on the thinner side of things so that I can easily layer some thicker paint over the top, and this thinner paint will also make it just a little bit easier on me when I'm actually getting to the moose itself. This stage for me is very much the blocking in stage. I try not to focus on individual details, but rather what are the large blocks of color, what large blocks of value exist, and I try to separate those and establish those as much as I can within reason. I'll be painting this entire piece wet on wet oil paint, and so it's helpful for me to use a fan brush to smooth out along the way, especially with some of these foggy areas in the background where I want it to be very soft and very elegant. And when I'm painting with wet paint, a lot of times it's easy to leave the brush strokes and the brush marks, which can sort of take away from some of the effects I'm after, and so that nice soft fan brush comes in handy when I need it. The foreground, however, is full of sagebrush and grass, forbs, and so that doesn't need as much attention as the background itself. And so I'll go a little bit looser, I'll be more playful with my brush, I'll use thicker paint, and I welcome the rougher texture that starts to develop as I go. Some of the larger bushes and brush in this sage flat made for some really interesting composition, and I wanted to capture that in this piece. And so once I established the color and the composition overall and got a lot of coverage, I started to move in and get a little bit tighter with my brushwork as I added these bushes. And so I'm focused on separating the bush from the background and creating a lot of negative space and really breaking apart this area as a whole to create some realism right where the moose is standing. My focus overall for the scene is to keep the attention in the middle of the piece and fade it out near the edges. And so I didn't add as much detail on the bottom as much as I did around where the moose is walking through. And so when I paint the sage down low, I'm very much more expressive with my brushwork, and I'm focused again on those blocks of color rather than the individual leaves or twigs of the plants. At this stage, I don't feel finished with the background, but I'm ready to start with my moose. And so the first thing I think about is what are the darkest colors that exist. I use burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, and sometimes a little bit of white to lighten it up. So it's basically black for some of the underbelly and some of the darker shades of the moose, and then I add some white to create some of the highlights along the back and other areas that are more illuminated by the light above. Painting fur can be a very difficult thing, and a lot of times we try to overcompensate and paint every little piece of hair and fur detail. But it's very important for me not to do that and resist that, and instead go after the blocks of color, much like I did with the foreground. And this really helps me focus on my subject as a whole rather than getting stuck on small details. And so coverage and getting that coverage quickly is important to me at this stage when it comes to the animal itself. And so I'm really focused on what are those blocks of color that exist within the moose. They're all quite subtle, but I try to really pay attention to that and do my best in establishing that quickly and then take it in slow steps from there. The heads and faces of animals can always be some of the most difficult portions to paint. And so again, just like the body, I try not to overwhelm myself with all of the small details in the face, and I try to focus on what are the darkest points and what are the lightest points. And I start with the darks, I try to establish those and pay close attention. And then once I get those established, I start to add the lighter tones within and around those areas and slowly build up the shape of the face. When it comes to the antlers, it was pretty simple. I added burnt sienna and some white to some of this mixture to create a tan, brownish hue. And I really just tried to block it in as best I could, keep the shadows on the underside, and add some of the highlights on the top side. This part of the process really helps to have good reference. And so getting out and seeing your subjects, experiencing it, and paying attention to all those details in your photographs, your video, that's all really important in capturing an animal accurately and realistically, especially one that has antlers and just in general a lot going on around the area of the head. Now that I have most of the moose blocked in, I can start focusing on some of that hair detail, which will really bring out the realism. And so I'll use the backside of my dagger striper brush to create some very sharp and accurate brush marks, which will represent some highlights in the fur, as well as some highlights around the face, nose, and really try to capture the bone structures. And with some of those smaller details, I'll really try to resist overdoing it because just a little bit of effort can go a long ways in this instance. This is where I often talk about going back and forth a lot. And so I'll go back and forth from the highlights to the shadows over and over again, trying to slowly work my way towards the effect or the amount of realism that I'm really trying to capture. Throughout all of this, I try to remind myself that I can always make adjustments and make changes. When I'm working with wet paint, it's easy to erase, back up, and redo. So I try not to stress too hard on all of this and sort of just go with the flow. Now the eye and the area around the head and forehead can be very specific, especially with the snout, the nose, some of the details around the antler. And so I use just the tip of the brush like a needle to just slowly work my way using my reference as an aid to try and nitpick all of those small details. So the face is very important to me, and all of those small details around the forehead area is what I really try to focus on, if anything, when it comes to this moose overall, because that is what's going to give the largest impact on the amount of realism that is exhibited throughout the animal. When I get to this stage, I'm thinking more about some of the highlights, some of the extras, adding some of the magic. And so I start to branch away from my reference overall. And I really focus on what I'm feeling at the time. And this is why it's important to get out and experience your subjects in person and try not to focus or rely too much on outside sources. because this is going to help you really bring out your own experience into your work. And that is where I really think about what creates the magic in our artwork. So when it comes to this stage, I'm thinking about exaggerating some of the highlights in the sagebrush. I'm thinking about maybe what could be some interesting features on the moose, like perhaps some frost on the top of the back, which I'll add near the end, maybe some extra highlights on the antlers. But this is also when I finalize the piece. And so what I'm focused on right now is the area around where the moose is standing. So this, when I say back and forth, also applies to the moose and then its surroundings. Back to the moose, back to the foreground, back to the moose, maybe back to the background. So it's not just applied to individual things, highlights and shadows and back and forth, but it can also be applied to going from the animal or the subject to the scene overall and around the subject, and then going back to the subject. And so it's a constant pull and tug as I work my way towards the finish line. And so again, with this, I'm trying to see how far I can push the detail in relation to what I'm feeling and without distracting from the moose. And so I'm adding a lot of small detail in the sagebrush, and I'm starting to identify areas that I think need to be darker, because once I added that dark moose to the scene, everything else became much lighter because that dark moose really stands out. And so I wanted to contrast that a little bit by having some darker shadows in the foreground as well, especially up near the bottom of the painting. You'll see me add some of those darker colors as we get towards the finish, as well as some of that brush right next to the moose. And so this is right before I get into those final details, those tiny things that really bring things to life and add the magic. I'm focused on getting everything as far as I feel like I can before adding those final touches. And so while I'm adding a lot of detail, I'm not necessarily adding a lot of really thick paint just yet. It's right before I begin to do that, and I'm really setting the stage for that. So I'm focused on breaking all of the sagebrush apart, trying to get some of that realism. I really don't think there's much of a right or wrong way to go about this at this stage. It's just a matter of keeping the brush moving and correcting your mistakes along the way. With the wet paint behind the bush, this is actually one of the more challenging parts of the painting because it all kind of wanted to blend together, and any of these areas that sort of protruded out into that white area behind took a little extra effort, and that's when I started to add some of that thicker paint to try and cover over the top of it without smearing it or blending it, making it muddy into that background. And there's no special trick to this. It just takes a lot of extra time. And so there was a lot of time that went into this willow or this bush. I thought that really emphasizing the color, the yellow in this and some of the greens would really contrast everything as a whole. And it was the one thing that I wanted to have an extra amount of detail in to sort of complement the moose with all of the realism and detail in that as well. A lot of times when I'm painting wildlife, my landscapes might have less detail or less realism around the animal, and the animal itself has an extraordinary amount of detail and realism. But that really helps you keep focus on the animal subject without distracting with its surroundings, and at the same time gives the viewer more opportunity and room to let their imagination take it from there and complete the rest of the scene. So at this point, I would consider myself to be in the cleanup stages of my painting. This is where I really try to refine some of the edges of the moose itself. I try to refine some of the negative space in the brush. I try to think about anything that maybe needs to be a little bit sharper, or maybe on the other hand, needs to be a little bit smoother. I try to really focus on the things that I don't like about the painting and ask myself, what can I do to adjust it to better please what I'm hoping to accomplish? So another thing that I thought about at this stage was darkening the top of the painting. I thought that it would help lead the viewer's eye towards the middle where the moose is standing. And at this point, the fog is actually beginning to dry. And so this is more so wet over dry, and it's almost more of a glaze on top of the wet paint below. It started off with a little bit of a greenish hue, and then I went back into that with more blue to try and create some cooler tones, and it gave it a little bit more of a dynamic look. After that, it was finishing up a few details, the frost on its back. Moose are such a fun subject to paint, and I'm definitely going to be exploring this experience with more 8x10 studies, as well as a larger piece, which will be soon to come. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.